I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
King Charles had prepared himself for difficult rulings, painful family divisions, and even surrendering royal authority. But nothing prepared him for the sentence placed before him that morning. The Crown's senior lawyers had reached a final conclusion. Catherine, not Camilla, would inherit Queen Elizabeth's private collection of crown jewels. As Charles read the confirmation, the king's expression collapsed, and the room fell completely silent. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles sat frozen behind his desk, the legal memorandum open beneath his hands. A memorandum was a legal summary, and this one offered no comfort. It confirmed that Catherine would inherit the late Queen's private collection of tiaras, brooches, necklaces, ceremonial pieces, and family heirlooms held outside the state-owned regalia. Those jewels were personal property, governed by inheritance papers, custodial agreements, and Elizabeth's recorded wishes. The king removed his glasses and placed them beside the file. Then he looked at the senior lawyer and asked him to repeat the conclusion aloud. The words came slowly, but struck with brutal force. Charles could authorize ceremonial use of selected pieces during his reign, yet he could not sell them, permanently reassign them, or place them inside Camilla's future estate. His mother had built a path beyond him, one even the sovereign could not redirect. Camilla waited in the adjoining room, expecting clarity about which jewels remained available. When Charles entered without the document and refused to meet her eyes, she understood before he spoke. The queen consort did not demand an explanation. She gripped the arm of her chair and asked whether Catherine now controlled everything. His silence answered first. Catherine received the news privately at Windsor, where William watched her read the ruling. The arrangement granted immediate custodial authority, meaning responsibility for protecting, lending, recording, and preserving the collection, followed by complete personal inheritance upon Charles's death or abdication. She did not smile. Instead, she lowered the pages and told the prince that this decision would wound his father, isolate Camilla, and place their marriage inside a conflict shaped by Elizabeth's final judgment. William tried to reassure her, but Catherine turned to the handwritten instruction behind the legal pages. Elizabeth referred to a palace incident that had changed her mind completely. The note did not name the event. It stated that after witnessing it, she knew who must protect the collection. Charles believed the lawyers had merely delivered a legal conclusion, but Catherine understood something far more dangerous. To know why Elizabeth chose her, they would first have to confront what every person in the family stood to lose. The jewels may have belonged to a queen, but the battle surrounding them was painfully human. For Charles, the ruling felt like a final judgment from his mother. For Camilla, it threatened the security of her place in royal history. For William, it became a test of loyalty between his father and his wife. And for Catherine, the inheritance arrived not as a triumph, but as a burden wrapped in diamonds, memory, and unresolved grief. Catherine stood alone, with the legal summary held tightly in both hands, while William watched from across the room. The document described her as the future custodian, meaning the person legally responsible for protecting, recording, lending, and preserving the private collection. She had worn Elizabeth's historic pieces for years with restraint, never treating them as trophies. That discipline had convinced the late monarch that she understood the difference between displaying royal history and claiming it. Yet before reaching the final list of jewels, Catherine folded the pages shut and quietly said, "I never asked for this." William moved closer, but his answer would not come easily. He felt proud that his grandmother had trusted Catherine with something so personal. Yet defending that decision could deepen his father's pain. Silence might protect Charles from another confrontation, but it would leave his wife carrying the burden alone. The prince finally admitted that Elizabeth had once told him Catherine would be asked to protect what cannot be replaced. He had assumed she meant royal duty, the lifelong responsibility of serving the crown, not a collection protected by legal agreements. Charles felt the loss more deeply with every passing hour. The jewels were among his last private links to his mother, carrying memories no public ceremony could reproduce. Losing control over their future made the king believe Elizabeth had trusted the next generation more than she trusted his judgment. He summoned an elderly courtier who had served the late queen for decades and asked whether she had doubted him. The courtier lowered his eyes. That hesitation lasted only seconds, but it made Charles's face tighten, as though the answer had been spoken aloud. Camilla feared something different. The queen consort cared about the collection's value, but its symbolism frightened her more. If Catherine controlled Elizabeth's most recognizable private jewels, every state banquet and national ceremony could present the younger royal as the monarchy's true female center. She asked Charles whether the decision could be delayed. He told her the lawyers had closed that path, and Camilla understood that her place beside the king could no longer guarantee control over the symbols surrounding him. Charles then remembered a private meeting Elizabeth had requested with Catherine after a major royal ceremony. No official minutes existed, meaning no formal written record had been kept, and neither woman had ever revealed what was said. That missing conversation suddenly felt decisive. It led back 3 years, to one disputed tiara, one private disagreement, and one sentence from Camilla that convinced Elizabeth the collection's future was no longer secure. The inheritance had divided the living, but its true origin remained buried in the final years of Elizabeth's reign. Inside a single evening, the palace had worked hard to forget. Long before the lawyers placed Catherine's name before Charles, Queen Elizabeth had already witnessed the moment that decided the jewel's fate. It happened after a state banquet, away from cameras and applause, when a disagreement over Queen Mary's most personal tiara exposed a deeper struggle over ownership, entitlement, and legacy. Those present believed the argument would fade by morning. Instead, Elizabeth returned to Windsor and ordered her private secretary to summon the crown's legal advisors. Elizabeth had always treated her personally inherited jewels differently from official regalia. The regalia were the ceremonial objects held for the monarchy itself, while these private pieces belonged to the family through personal inheritance. Every tiara, brooch, and necklace carried memories of her mother, grandmother, father, marriage, and reign. That was why the growing requests to reorganize future access troubled her. They sounded practical, but beneath the polite language, the discussion was becoming a quiet contest over which royal woman would control the strongest symbols of continuity. Camilla made her position clear after the banquet at Buckingham Palace. She argued privately that Queen Mary's sapphire bandeau should be reserved permanently for the future queen consort's household rather than remain available for Catherine. The queen consort framed it as orderly planning, yet Catherine heard something more possessive in the request. She tried to soften the exchange, but the tension had already traveled beyond the jewel itself. Elizabeth entered from the doorway of her private sitting room before either woman realized she had been listening. The monarch walked to the open case, placed one gloved hand across it, and looked directly at Camilla. "No one inherits meaning merely by inheriting position," she said. The correction was calm, but its force was unmistakable. Although only Catherine and 2 senior attendants were present, the queen consort felt exposed. She left with controlled dignity, yet Elizabeth noticed that she never once asked what the bandeau had meant to the women who wore it before her. Catherine remained behind and offered to withdraw from consideration entirely. She told the queen that no jewel was worth dividing the family. Elizabeth rejected that instinct at once. She warned that surrendering responsibility simply to avoid conflict could be as dangerous as chasing power, because it allowed the most determined person to control what belonged to history. Elizabeth acted the following morning. She met 2 lawyers and her private secretary without Charles present, then ordered a legal review separating her private collection from the sovereign's discretionary estate, meaning property a reigning monarch could otherwise manage or reassign. In a documented handwritten instruction, she named Catherine as the eventual inheritor and future custodian. Her reason was devastatingly simple. The woman most willing to walk away from the jewels was the woman least likely to exploit them. Charles later learned that his mother had recorded the entire banquet dispute in her own hand. He demanded to see the note, and when Catherine was called into the room, the controlled legal discussion began to fracture. What began with a tiara had become a judgment about character, and when Charles finally faced her across a closed palace room, neither could pretend the decision belonged only to the dead. There were no aides, no cameras, and no carefully prepared palace language when Charles asked Catherine to meet him. Only the king, the future queen, and Elizabeth's handwritten note lay between them. He did not accuse her of taking the jewels, but his voice carried something more painful than anger: the belief that she had been welcomed into a final confidence from which he, his mother's own son, had been deliberately excluded. Charles pushed the note across the table and asked when Elizabeth had first told her. Catherine did not touch the paper. She said the late monarch had never revealed the legal arrangement, only warned that she might one day be asked to protect something the family could not afford to lose. The king had summoned her to discuss postponing custodial control, meaning the legal duty to record use, approve loans, protect the jewels, and prevent permanent reassignment. If she delayed, he could preserve the appearance that the collection still belonged within his household. Catherine understood why that appearance mattered. Charles feared the decision would make him look powerless inside his own family, while Camilla's future position could seem weaker each time another royal woman wore one of Elizabeth's pieces. Yet the agreement did not allow Catherine to accept the inheritance while refusing its responsibilities. She could not simply step aside whenever the pressure became uncomfortable. Charles asked the question he had been holding back. Why had his mother trusted Catherine with the collection, but not trusted him to decide its future? She chose her words carefully. Perhaps Elizabeth had not acted against him, she said. Perhaps the arrangement had been designed to survive everyone, including people acting out of love, grief, fear, or loyalty. The king's restraint finally broke. He said he had spent his entire life preserving his mother's crown, yet her final instructions now made him appear incapable of protecting her jewels. Catherine answered that preservation was not an insult to him. It was a boundary placed around every person who might one day confuse access with ownership. Charles then produced a private family statement granting Camilla unrestricted lifetime access. Catherine read it once and refused to sign. Unrestricted access, she explained, could weaken the legal separation Elizabeth had deliberately created. The issue was not whether the queen consort could wear the jewels. The danger was whether any household could slowly turn temporary use into permanent possession. Charles rose so quickly that his chair scraped backwards. He turned away and stood in silence before telling Catherine that accepting the inheritance would change their relationship. She replied that ignoring Elizabeth's wishes would change who she was. Catherine left without taking the note. Moments later, Charles ordered a full review of the lawyer's authority. But that review would expose something even more unsettling. The decisive power no longer rested with the king alone, and the person holding the strongest legal position had not yet spoken. Charles had confronted Catherine as a father-in-law and a wounded son, but the next battle would not be decided by emotion. It would be decided by the hidden architecture of royal power. Charles still possessed the crown, the palaces, and the constitutional authority of the sovereign. But over Elizabeth's private collection, he discovered walls even kings could not cross. The late queen had not written a sentimental request that could be softened within the family. She had constructed a legal fortress. Trustees had been appointed, inventories sealed, conditions recorded, and Catherine's rights protected by clauses designed to resist pressure from any reigning household. Sir Jonathan Hale entered with the final legal file and placed it before the king. A legal trust was an arrangement that required appointed people to control property according to fixed instructions, and this one gave 3 trustees power to enforce Elizabeth's wishes regardless of the monarch's preference. Catherine had been named both principal beneficiary and designated custodian, meaning she would preserve the jewels, approve their use, maintain their history, and eventually pass them to the next generation. Hale kept his hands steady, but his voice softened when he admitted that the late queen had anticipated her son's distress. Charles opened the document and searched for a route around the settlement. He asked Hale to identify the clause granting royal discretion, the power a sovereign might normally use to manage family property. The lawyer turned several pages, paused, then closed the file. There was no such clause. The king stared at the sealed cover without speaking, while Hale understood that every legal answer sounded like another rejection from a mother who could no longer explain herself. Camilla stepped into the discussion and asked whether the trustees were effectively placing Catherine above the queen consort. Hale answered carefully. Catherine held authority over the collection, not over Camilla herself. Yet that distinction offered little comfort, because control of the jewels carried enormous symbolic weight. Every loan, ceremony, and future appearance would now require approval from the woman many already viewed as the monarchy's next female center. The lawyer then revealed the strongest protection in a documented explanation attached to the trust. Any attempt to pressure Catherine into surrendering control would trigger an automatic transfer of temporary authority to an independent preservation board, a neutral group responsible only for safeguarding the collection. That would remove the jewels from every royal household until the dispute ended. Charles finally understood that resistance would not restore his power. It would take the collection away from the family entirely. Hale opened a second envelope and confirmed that Elizabeth had recorded a private audio declaration. In that recording, the late monarch explained that the collection must belong to the woman who understands that wearing history is not the same as owning it. The words struck Charles with brutal clarity. His mother had not protected Catherine because she sought power, but because she had repeatedly refused to treat royal history as personal possession. Charles abandoned the legal challenge, but the consequences were already moving through the palace. Inventories were transferred, permissions rewritten, and security access quietly changed. Within hours, Camilla would encounter the first unmistakable sign that the old order had ended. The law had closed every route Charles might have used to reverse the decision, leaving the family to face something colder than defeat: the immediate reality of Catherine's authority. The first consequence did not arrive through a public announcement or a dramatic palace decree. It came through a locked door. Camilla entered the secure jewelry corridor, expecting the same access she had held for years, only to discover that the code had been changed under Catherine's new custodial authority. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The small red light above the keypad told her everything the lawyers had already told Charles. Camilla entered the old code again and heard the denial tone a second time. An equerry stepped forward and explained that all access now required written approval from Catherine's team. The new system covered the occasion, length of use, conservation needs, security arrangements, and exact return date. No royal household would receive automatic entry. The queen consort dismissed him quietly, but her expression hardened as the door remained closed. Catherine's custodial staff had already begun a complete inventory of Elizabeth's private collection. They were separating personal heirlooms from crown-owned regalia, the ceremonial objects held for the monarchy rather than any individual, while recording every piece currently used by royal households. That distinction mattered, because one group could pass through private inheritance, while the other belonged permanently to the institution. For Camilla, however, the difference felt painfully personal. She had gone from queen consort to applicant. Charles found her later sitting alone with an old photograph of Elizabeth wearing the sapphire bandeau. Camilla admitted that she could endure public criticism, cold headlines, and whispers about her place in history. What she could not endure was feeling permanently judged by a woman she could no longer answer. The king sat beside her, but comfort did not come easily. He shared her hurt, even as he knew the legal structure had left them no simple path back. Camilla's humiliation deepened when the updated inventory reached her office. A historic necklace previously assigned to her for an upcoming diplomatic reception had been withdrawn on Catherine's instruction. A diplomatic reception was a formal gathering where senior royals welcomed foreign representatives, making every jewel part of the monarchy's public message. At first, the queen consort believed the necklace had been reserved for Catherine. Then the truth arrived. Catherine had placed the piece on a 5-year preservation hold. She would not wear it. No one would. Her first major act was not competitive but protective, removing the necklace from use because its setting had weakened, and repeated handling could damage it permanently. Charles read the conservation report twice. For the first time, he saw that Catherine was not using the inheritance to humiliate Camilla or display superiority. Yet the realization brought another wound. Elizabeth had trusted that restraint before giving him the chance to prove his own. William understood that legal documents would never repair what grief had broken. He asked Charles to meet without lawyers, secretaries, or Camilla. The locked door had made the new reality undeniable, but it would take a conversation between father and son to decide whether that reality destroyed the family or forced it to tell the truth. William did not enter the room as an heir defending his future queen. He entered as a son who could see his father disappearing beneath an old wound. There were no lawyers between them, no ceremonial language, and no demand for surrender. William simply told Charles that Elizabeth's decision was never proof that he had failed. It was proof that she feared grief, marriage, duty, and power might eventually become impossible for one person to separate. William closed the library door himself and left his phone outside. Then he faced his father and said he would speak not as Prince of Wales, the title given to the monarch's direct heir, but as his son. Charles did not answer at first. He had interpreted the inheritance as a final rejection, and that belief was already poisoning his trust in Catherine while pushing Camilla deeper into isolation. Unless the pain was named honestly, the family would keep treating Elizabeth's protection as an act of betrayal. Charles finally admitted what he had refused to say aloud. He had spent his life waiting for his mother's complete confidence. Learning that she had secretly placed her most personal royal legacy with Catherine made him feel he had failed a final test he never knew he was taking. The king said he could accept losing control of jewels, but not the thought that Elizabeth had looked beyond him because she expected him to choose badly. William moved closer and told him that the late queen had understood his instinct to protect the people he loved. She did not condemn that loyalty. She feared what loyalty could do when mixed with grief and power. Elizabeth had watched royal possessions become weapons inside private rivalries, so she divided responsibility to ensure no future monarch held emotional and legal control over everything. The prince then revealed the conversation he had carried in silence. Weeks before Elizabeth's death, she had spoken to him privately and made him promise that Catherine would never be pressured into surrendering the collection, even by someone she loved. William had believed the warning referred to Charles or Camilla. Only now did he understand that it included himself. Charles looked up sharply. William repeated that the legal barriers protected the jewels from every member of the family, including the future king. No one had been judged immune to fear, loyalty, ambition, or weakness. That truth changed the meaning of Elizabeth's decision. She had not chosen Catherine because everyone else was unworthy. She had chosen her because Catherine did not see the collection as proof of superiority. The king's anger finally softened. He admitted that restraint, not rank, had secured the inheritance. Charles agreed to support the arrangement publicly, though both men knew the hardest test was still ahead. Newspapers, broadcasters, crowds, and palace factions were waiting to turn private grief into a royal war. Father and son left the library without resolving every hurt. Yet Charles had made one decisive choice. When the world learned the truth, he would no longer stand against Catherine. By sunrise, the inheritance was no longer a private wound inside palace walls. It was the story dominating Britain. Newspapers framed it as a victory for Catherine, a humiliation for Camilla, and a devastating final message to Charles from his mother. Yet amid the shouting headlines, one image changed the tone. The king arriving beside Catherine at Buckingham Palace, pausing before the cameras, and deliberately allowing her to walk through the central doors at his side. Buckingham Palace released a formal statement confirming that Catherine had accepted custodial responsibility for Elizabeth's private jewelry collection under the late monarch's legally recorded wishes. Custodial responsibility meant protecting the pieces, approving their use, preserving their history, and ensuring they passed safely to the next generation. The announcement mattered because it transformed a private family arrangement into an official royal reality. It also ended any hope that the decision could be quietly reversed. The London Chronicle captured the public mood with a front page showing Catherine beneath the headline, "Elizabeth's Final Choice." A smaller photograph showed Charles leaving the legal meeting with his face visibly strained. Commentators describe the inheritance as a transfer of symbolic power from Camilla to the future Princess of Wales, focusing on succession, female authority, and the trust Elizabeth had placed in the younger royal. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, carrying photographs of the late Queen. Applause began near the Victoria Memorial when Charles and Catherine arrived together, then spread across the forecourt. People called Elizabeth's name rather than Catherine's. The sound briefly broke her composure, and William touched her arm before she stepped forward beside the king. The gesture reminded her that the collection was not a prize, it was grief made visible. Camilla watched the live broadcast from Clarence House, the London residence used by senior members of the royal family. Public support for Catherine deepened her sadness, but one detail stopped her resentment from hardening. The future queen wore no piece from the inherited collection. She had chosen restraint at the very moment triumph would have been easiest. Charles reached the prepared statement, paused, and abandoned it. Speaking directly to the assembled representatives, he said his mother had chosen Catherine because preservation required humility, discipline, and service. The king then confirmed his complete support for the legal settlement and promised that Elizabeth's collection would remain protected according to her wishes. Camilla heard those words in silence. Catherine lowered her head, while William understood that his father had done more than accept a document. Charles had ended the appearance of resistance before the entire country. Britain had seen the king accept his mother's decision, but only behind closed doors could the family decide whether those jewels would remain symbols of rejection or become instruments of reconciliation. The crisis ended where it had begun, not before the nation, but around a private table with one sealed jewel case resting between three people. Charles carried the pain of a son who had misunderstood his mother's final protection. Camilla carried the humiliation of feeling passed over. Catherine carried an inheritance she had never sought. Yet when the case was finally opened, no one reached for the diamonds. They spoke instead about Elizabeth, and what she had been trying to save. Charles had invited both women to a private room at Windsor, without lawyers, senior aides, or prepared statements. He wanted one final answer about how the collection would be used during his reign. Catherine explained that Elizabeth's private jewels should remain a living family archive, meaning a protected collection that could still serve future generations rather than become the exclusive property of one household's public image. That principle mattered because the pieces carried family memory, but also because every future loan could either heal the division or deepen it. Catherine placed the sapphire bandeau case in front of Camilla and offered its use for a future state banquet. The same preservation rules would apply to both of them, including formal approval, careful handling, and a fixed return date. The queen consort did not accept immediately. She asked why Catherine would offer the very tiara connected to the disagreement that had changed Elizabeth's plans. Catherine answered without triumph. Protection without generosity, she said, would betray the purpose of the inheritance. She had not accepted the collection to punish Camilla or replace her. She had accepted it because Elizabeth believed history survived only when no single person treated it as personal territory. The queen consort looked at the closed case again, and for the first time, she understood that the offer was not an act of superiority. It was a way back. Charles then admitted what his devastation had truly meant. He had believed his mother chose Catherine instead of him, as though the inheritance were a final verdict on his worth. Now the king understood that Elizabeth had chosen her for a duty he was never supposed to carry alone. That truth did not erase his pain, but it finally gave the pain meaning. Catherine presented a written family protocol, a clear set of rules, ensuring that suitable pieces could be worn by future royal women, while ownership, conservation, and historical records remained protected from private claims. Camilla accepted the arrangement and admitted that her earlier demand for permanent household priority had made symbolism painfully personal. Charles signed the acknowledgement, formally ending every challenge to Catherine's inheritance. The trustees closed the dispute, and the palace recognized her as the lawful custodian and eventual owner of Elizabeth's private crown jewels collection. The jewels remained brilliant, but their deepest value was finally clear. Elizabeth had not used them to choose a winner. She had used them to teach her family that the crown survives only when duty matters more than ownership. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.